The telegram had promised her a school teacher. The man standing on the platform wore a gun and smelled like horses and whiskey. Caroline Merrick's fingers went numb around the handle of her carpetbag. "Miss Merrick," his voice came out rough, like he hadn't used it much lately. Dust clung to the creases of his shirt, and his eyes were the color of smoke, gray and restless. "I'm here for you." She stepped back. The train hissed behind her, already preparing to leave Redemption Flats behind like it had good sense. "You're not Thomas Whitfield." "No, ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat but didn't take it off. "Jake Brennan, Thomas sent me to fetch you." The sun hammered down on the depot platform, turning the planks hot enough to feel through her boots. Caroline's corset squeezed the breath from her lungs, and she couldn't tell if it was the heat or the panic rising in her chest. She'd traveled 1,700 miles from Philadelphia to marry a man she'd never met, relying on 3 letters that promised a stable life teaching children in a frontier town. The letters had been signed by Thomas Whitfield, businessman and town council member. They hadn't mentioned Jake Brennan. "Where is Mr. Whitfield?" She forced herself to stand straighter, even though exhaustion pulled at every muscle in her body. "He was supposed to meet me himself." Jake shifted his weight, and the holster at his hip caught the sunlight. "He got held up in Silverton. Business deal went sideways. Asked me to bring you to his place and make sure you're settled proper." "I see." She didn't see anything except that her carefully constructed plan was already crumbling. Behind Jake, Redemption Flats sprawled across the valley floor, a scatter of buildings that looked like they'd been dropped from the sky and forgotten. Nothing like the bustling town Thomas had described. "Your trunk's already loaded." Jake nodded toward a wagon hitched to 2 tired-looking horses. "It's a short ride to the Whitfield house." Caroline's hands were shaking. She gripped the carpetbag tighter. "This isn't proper. A woman traveling alone with a man who isn't." "There's a chaperone." He gestured toward the wagon, where an elderly woman sat fanning herself with a newspaper. "Mrs. Alvarez. She runs the boarding house. Thomas arranged it." The old woman waved, her brown face creased with smile lines. That small gesture made Caroline's chest loosen just slightly. She glanced back at the train. The conductor was already climbing aboard. If she wanted to leave, this was her last chance. But leave to where? Philadelphia held nothing for her anymore. Her father's debts had eaten through everything, and the creditors had taken the house 3 weeks after his funeral. Her aunt had offered her a place as an unpaid servant, caring for 5 children and sleeping in the attic. At least Thomas Whitfield had offered marriage, a teaching position, and a house of her own. Even if he hadn't shown up to claim her himself. "Fine," the word came out harder than she intended. "Let's go." Jake took her carpetbag without asking, and she let him because her arms ached from carrying it all morning. His fingers brushed hers for just a second, calloused, warm, and then he was walking toward the wagon, his boots kicking up little clouds of dust with each step. Mrs. Alvarez scooted over to make room. "Don't you mind Jake's manners, dear. He's rough around the edges, but he's good people." Caroline climbed up, her skirts tangling around her legs. The wagon smelled like hay and leather, and the seat was hard beneath her. Jake swung up into the driver's position, took the reins, and clicked his tongue. The horses jerked forward. Redemption Flats looked worse up close. Half the buildings leaned at odd angles, and the main street was mostly dirt with a few planks thrown down where the mud probably got deep. A saloon, a general store, a church with a crooked steeple. 3 women stood outside the mercantile, watching the wagon pass. Their faces were hard, measuring. "Thomas owns the biggest ranch around here," Mrs. Alvarez said, patting Caroline's knee. "You'll be comfortable. The house is real nice." "How long have you known Mr. Whitfield?" Caroline asked. "Oh, 10 years or so. He came here after the war, bought up land when nobody else had 2 coins to rub together. Smart man, ambitious." "And Mr. Brennan?" Jake's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around. Mrs. Alvarez's smile dimmed. "Jake worked for Thomas before. They had a falling-out couple years back. Surprised me when Thomas asked him to pick you up, tell you the truth." "What kind of falling out?" "That's their business, dear." The wagon rattled along a road that cut through brown grassland stretching in every direction. Mountains rose in the distance, blue and hazy in the heat. Caroline's dress stuck to her back, and her head throbbed. She'd imagined this moment differently, Thomas greeting her with flowers maybe, or at least a smile. Instead, she was trapped in a wagon with a stranger who apparently had bad history with her future husband. The Whitfield house appeared after 20 minutes of silence. It sat on a rise overlooking a valley, 2 stories of white-painted wood with a wide porch and green shutters. Barns and corrals spread out behind it, and Caroline could see cattle grazing in the far pastures. It was grander than she'd expected, almost elegant despite the rough country surrounding it. "Here we are." Jake pulled the horses to a stop and jumped down. He reached up to help Mrs. Alvarez, then turned to Caroline. She ignored his outstretched hand and climbed down herself, stumbling on the last step. Her ankle twisted, and she would have fallen if Jake hadn't caught her elbow. His grip was firm, steadying. "Careful," he said quietly. She pulled away. "I'm fine." A Mexican woman opened the front door and came down the porch steps, wiping her hands on her apron. "You must be Miss Merrick. I'm Rosa. I keep house for Mr. Whitfield." Her English was accented, but clear, her smile genuine. Come in, you must be exhausted." The inside of the house was cool and shadowy, furnished with heavy dark wood and thick rugs. Rosa showed her to a bedroom on the second floor, a real bed with a quilted coverlet, a wardrobe, a washstand with a porcelain pitcher. Luxury compared to the narrow cot she'd slept on at her aunt's house. "Mr. Whitfield will be back tomorrow," Rosa said, setting Caroline's carpet bag on a chair. "He asked me to make you comfortable. There's water for washing, and I'll bring up lunch soon." "Thank you," Caroline's voice cracked. She was so tired she could barely stand. Rosa hesitated at the door. "Jake will be staying in the bunkhouse tonight, in case you were worried." After Rosa left, Caroline sank onto the bed and finally let herself cry. Not loud sobs, just silent tears that ran down her face and dripped onto her dress. She'd been holding everything together for so long, through her father's death, through the humiliation of the creditors taking their furniture piece by piece, through the long train journey west. Now, in this strange house that was supposed to be her new home, she felt like she was falling apart. She cried until she had nothing left, then washed her face and changed into a clean dress. When Rosa brought lunch, soup, and fresh bread, Caroline forced herself to eat. She was going to be Thomas Whitfield's wife. She was going to teach children in Redemption Flats. She was going to make this work. Even if nothing about it felt right. That evening she sat on the porch and watched the sun sink behind the mountains. The air cooled quickly once the sun dropped, and she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. Voices carried from the bunkhouse, men laughing, the clink of bottles. She wondered which laugh belonged to Jake. Footsteps on the porch made her turn. Jake walked toward her, a plate of food in his hands. "Rosa thought you might want supper out here," he said. "Thank you." She took the plate, stew and cornbread, and set it on the small table beside her chair. "You don't need to wait on me." Wasn't planning to, but he leaned against the porch railing instead of leaving, his eyes on the darkening valley. "Nice view." "Yes." Silence stretched between them. Caroline ate mechanically, aware of him standing there, solid and present in a way that made her uncomfortable. She wasn't used to men who didn't fill every silence with chatter. "Can I ask you something?" Her own voice surprised her. "Sure." "What did you and Thomas argue about?" Jake was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I wanted to run the ranch different than he did, treat the hands better, pay fair wages. Thomas sees things in terms of profit. I see them in terms of people." He glanced at her. "We are different kinds of men." "But you came when he asked." "He's paying me and," he paused, "wanted to make sure you got here safe." "Why would you care?" His eyes met hers, and something in them made her breath catch. "Because coming out here to marry a stranger takes guts, and Thomas isn't," he stopped himself. "It's not my place to say." "Thomas isn't what?" Jake pushed off from the railing. "Get some rest, Miss Merrick. Tomorrow's a big day." He walked away before she could press him further, his boots hollow on the porch boards. Caroline stared after him, her meal forgotten, the way he'd looked at her, just for that moment, like he saw something in her worth protecting. She shook her head. She was being foolish. Jake Brennan was nothing to her. Tomorrow, Thomas would arrive, and her new life would begin properly. But sleep wouldn't come that night. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the wind rattle the shutters and the distant sound of coyotes howling. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jake's face, those smoke-gray eyes that seemed to look straight through her careful composure to the frightened woman underneath. Morning came with a knock on her door. Rosa, bringing coffee and warm rolls. "Mr. Whitfield just rode in," Rosa said. "He's cleaning up now, says he'll meet you for breakfast in 20 minutes. Caroline's stomach knotted. She dressed in her best remaining gown, dark blue with white lace at the collar, and pinned her hair up carefully. Her hands shook as she fastened her mother's cameo at her throat. Thomas Whitfield was exactly what she'd expected. Tall, well-dressed, clean-shaven. His hair was dark and slicked back, his smile practiced. He stood when she entered the dining room, and his eyes traveled over her with an assessing look that made her skin prickle. "Miss Merrick," he took her hand and kissed it. "My deepest apologies for not meeting your train. Business matters are unpredictable out here." "I understand." She didn't really, but what else could she say? They sat. Rosa served eggs and ham and potatoes. Thomas talked while they ate, about his ranch, his holdings, his plans to expand. He mentioned the school, how she'd start teaching in 2 weeks after they were married. Everything was already decided, arranged. Caroline's role was simply to agree. "You're quiet," Thomas said finally, setting down his fork. "Overwhelmed, I suppose." "It's a lot to take in." "Of course, but you'll adjust quickly, I'm sure. You seem like a sensible woman," he smiled. "That's why I chose you. Sensible and respectable, those are rare qualities." Chose her like she was livestock at auction. Caroline forced a smile. "You're very kind." After breakfast, Thomas showed her around the property. He talked about cattle prices and water rights and fence lines. He never asked about her journey, her life in Philadelphia, what she hoped for in this marriage. She was a piece fitting into his carefully constructed life, nothing more. They were walking back toward the house when Jake rode up on a dappled mare. He swung down from the saddle, his movements easy and practiced. "Finished repairing that fence on the south pasture," he said to Thomas. "The posts should hold through winter now." "Good." Thomas barely glanced at him. "Make sure Gomez knows about it." "Will do." Jake's eyes shifted to Caroline for just a second, and she saw concern there. Then he turned and led his horse toward the barn. "You've kept Jake on?" Caroline asked, surprising herself. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Temporarily. He's a good hand when he keeps his opinions to himself, but he won't be here long." "I see." That afternoon, Caroline sat in the parlor pretending to read, while Thomas worked on ledgers at his desk. The house felt like a cage, beautiful and suffocating. Through the window, she could see Jake working with the horses in the corral, patient and gentle, with a skittish colt. The contrast between him and Thomas was stark, one man trying to control everything around him, the other working with the natural rhythm of things. She shouldn't be comparing them. Thomas was going to be her husband. That was settled. Except nothing felt settled. Everything felt wrong. The next 3 days passed in a blur of wedding preparations. Mrs. Alvarez and several other women from town came to help, altering a dress for the ceremony, baking, decorating the parlor with wildflowers. They were kind but distant, and Caroline caught whispers behind hands, sidelong looks. The Eastern bride, the woman Thomas bought. She saw Jake only at a distance. He was always working, fixing fences, training horses, hauling water. But sometimes she'd look up and find him watching her, and her heart would do something strange and unsettling. The night before the wedding, she couldn't sleep again. Near midnight, she gave up and went downstairs, thinking to make tea. A lamp burned in Thomas's study, and his voice carried through the half-open door. "Don't care what it takes. I want that water contract signed before winter." Another man's voice, unfamiliar. "Hastings won't budge on the price, Thomas." "Then persuade him. I own half this valley. I'll own all of it within 5 years. A pause. The wedding tomorrow solidifies my position. A respectable wife, a teacher for the town, people trust that. They'll support my bid for territorial representative. Caroline's blood went cold. She stood frozen in the hallway, her nightgown ghostly in the darkness. What about Brennan? The other man asked. He's been talking to some of the smaller ranchers, stirring up trouble about your land deals. Thomas's laugh was sharp. Jake's a fool. Idealistic fools don't last long out here. Once I'm married, I'll run him off for good. Can't have him undermining my authority. Caroline backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound. She climbed the stairs like a sleepwalker, went into her room and closed the door. Then she sat on the bed, trembling. He'd chosen her because she made him look good, because a schoolteacher wife would help his political ambitions. Their marriage was a business transaction, nothing more, and he planned to hurt Jake, a man whose only crime seemed to be caring about fairness. She thought about her father, how he'd always told her to trust her instincts, how she'd ignored those instincts when she'd answered Thomas's advertisement, desperate for security. Security at what cost? Sleep never came. When dawn broke, Caroline dressed mechanically in the altered wedding gown, white cotton with pearl buttons. Rosa helped with her hair, weaving in small flowers. In the mirror, Caroline looked like a different person, a ghost bride. You're beautiful, Rosa said softly, but her eyes were sad. The ceremony was set for noon in the parlor. A circuit preacher had arrived that morning, along with most of Redemption Flats. People crowded into the house, smelling of soap and nervousness. Thomas stood by the makeshift altar in his best suit, smiling that practiced smile. Caroline walked down the stairs on Mrs. Alvarez's arm. Every step felt like walking toward a cliff edge. The preacher opened his Bible. Thomas reached for her hand. She looked at his face, handsome, cold, calculating. Then her eyes found Jake standing in the back corner, his hat in his hands. He looked miserable, like he was watching something terrible happen and couldn't stop it. Dearly beloved, the preacher began. Caroline's heart hammered. She thought about her father's debts, her aunt's attic, the long train journey. She thought about security and survival and the practical necessity of this marriage. Then she thought about Thomas's voice in the darkness. Idealistic fools don't last long. We are gathered here. No, the word came out of her mouth before she could stop it. Silence crashed through the room. Thomas's hand tightened on hers. Caroline. She pulled free. I'm sorry, I can't do this. His face went red. Don't be ridiculous, you're nervous, that's natural. I'm not nervous, her voice grew stronger. I'm certain this is wrong. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Alvarez gasped. Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice to a hiss. You came 1,700 miles to marry me. You have nowhere else to go. I know, she met his eyes steadily, but I'd rather have nowhere than have this. You're ruining everything. Thomas grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. You ungrateful. Jake moved through the crowd like a summer storm, swift and unstoppable. He pulled Thomas's hand off Caroline's arm, putting himself between them. Let her go, Jake said quietly. Thomas's face twisted with rage. This is none of your business, Brennan. This is my house, my wedding, my... She's not property, Thomas. She said no. The room held its breath. Caroline's legs shook, but she forced herself to stand straight. Thomas looked between them, and understanding dawned in his eyes, ugly and vicious. I see, you've been poisoning her against me. You want her for yourself. That's not, Jake started. Get out, Thomas's voice cracked across the room. Get out of my house. You're fired. If I see you on my land again, I'll have you arrested. Jake stood his ground. Caroline needs somewhere to stay. She can't. She can rot in the street for all I care. Thomas turned to the crowd. Show's over, everyone out. People filed out quickly, avoiding Caroline's eyes. She stood alone in her white dress, shaking. Mrs. Alvarez hurried over and took her hand. Come with me, dear. You'll stay at the boarding house. I don't have money. We'll figure it out. Mrs. Alvarez glared at Thomas. Shame on you. Caroline followed Mrs. Alvarez out, Jake walking behind them. On the porch, Caroline stopped and turned to him. I'm sorry, you lost your job because of me. Worth it, Jake said simply. Something in his eyes made her breath catch, the same look from that first evening, but deeper now. Like he saw all of her, the fear, the courage, the desperate hope, and didn't look away. The next week was hard. Caroline stayed at Mrs. Alvarez's boarding house, sleeping in a tiny room and helping with cooking and cleaning to pay her way. Thomas had spread word that she was unstable, untrustworthy. The school board informed her they couldn't hire someone with moral questions about her character. People whispered when she walked through town. Jake had left Redemption Flats the day after the failed wedding. Mrs. Alvarez said he'd gone to work on a ranch 2 valleys over. Caroline told herself she was relieved. The last thing she needed was more complications. But she missed him, the steady presence of him, the quiet kindness. She lay awake at night thinking about the way he'd stepped between her and Thomas without hesitation. 2 weeks after the wedding, Caroline was scrubbing floors when someone knocked on the boarding house door. Mrs. Alvarez answered, then called up the stairs. Caroline, you have a visitor. She dried her hands and went down, expecting another nosy townsperson. Instead, Jake stood in the entry hall, hat in hands, looking uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. I'm sorry to bother you, he said, but I wanted to check, see if you're all right. I'm managing. She was suddenly aware of her worn dress, her hair tied back with a faded ribbon. You rode 2 valleys to check on me. Couldn't stop thinking about, he cleared his throat, wanted to make sure Thomas wasn't causing trouble. He's ignoring me. That's almost worse than causing trouble. Jake shifted his weight. I have something to tell you. There's a school in Copper Ridge where I'm working now. They need a teacher. The pay's not much, but there's a little house that comes with it. I told them about you. They'd like to meet you. Hope fluttered in Caroline's chest. Truly. The schoolmaster there is old as dirt and honest as a new penny. He doesn't care what Thomas Whitfield says. Jake met her eyes. It's a hard life, Caroline. Copper Ridge is smaller than Redemption Flats, rougher, but it's honest work. Honest work sounds perfect. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his whole face, made him look younger. I thought you might say that. When would I start? Soon as you want. I can take you there tomorrow if you're ready. Caroline thought about Philadelphia, about her careful plans, about the life she'd imagined. None of it had been real anyway, just pretty lies she'd told herself to survive. This was real, a small town, a teaching job, the possibility of building something true. Tomorrow, she said, I'll be ready. Jake nodded, but he didn't leave. He stood there, turning his hat in his hands, looking like he wanted to say something else. What is it? Caroline asked softly. I need to be honest with you. He met her eyes, and she saw vulnerability there that made her heart ache. I know you just escaped one bad situation you probably aren't looking for. I mean, I know it's too soon. But I have to tell you, when I saw you step off that train, something in me I knew. And then watching you stand up to Thomas, watching you choose the hard right thing over the easy wrong thing, he stopped, swallowed. I'm not good with words. What I'm trying to say is I'd like a chance. Not now, not tomorrow, but someday, when you're ready, if you ever are. The world seemed to hold still. Caroline looked at this man, this rough, honest, unexpectedly gentle man, and felt something shift inside her. Not the desperate grasping for security that had driven her west. Something real and terrifying and right. I'm the wrong bride, she said quietly. That's what I told myself that first day. You came for Thomas's bride, but I was the wrong woman. Jake stepped closer. You were exactly right, just not for him. Jake. You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know, so you could think about it. No pressure, no expectations, just possibility. Possibility, what a beautiful, frightening word. I'll think about it, Caroline said, and then, surprising herself, but I don't think it will take as long as you might expect. His smile returned, tentative and hopeful. No. No, she smiled back, feeling it all the way to her bones. Some things you just know. They stood there in Mrs. Alvarez's entry hall, not touching but connected somehow, two broken people finding their way toward something whole. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust and possibility across the frontier. Tomorrow, Caroline would travel to Copper Ridge. She'd meet the old schoolmaster and see the little house that would become her home. She'd start teaching children to read and write and dream beyond their circumstances. And Jake would be there, not pushing, not demanding, just present, waiting for the day when she was ready to risk her heart again. But in that moment, standing in the dusty boarding house, while the late afternoon light slanted through the windows, Caroline thought maybe she was already ready. Maybe healing didn't always take as long as people said. Maybe sometimes it just took finding the right person at the wrong time and having the courage to wait for the time to become right. "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing me, the real me." Jake's eyes were warm, steady as stone. "Easiest thing I ever did." He left then, promising to return at dawn with a wagon. Caroline watched him walk away, and for the first time since her father died, she felt something like peace. The future was uncertain, still frightening, but it was hers to shape. Not Thomas's, not desperation's, hers. Mrs. Alvarez appeared at her elbow, watching Jake disappear down the street. "That one's a good man." "I know. The good ones are worth waiting for." Caroline smiled. "I think I've waited long enough. Now it's just about finding the courage to reach for what I want." "And do you have that courage?" Caroline thought about stepping off that train, about standing up in front of half of Redemption Flats and saying no, about choosing uncertainty over security. She'd been brave before. She could be brave again. "Yes," she said, "I think I do." That night she packed her few belongings and wrote a letter to her aunt, brief, factual, hopeful. She was alive. She was teaching. She was finding her way. In the morning, Jake arrived with the wagon as promised. Caroline climbed up beside him, her carpet bag at her feet, the same bag she'd carried from the train, but lighter now somehow, less burdened. As they rode out of Redemption Flats, Jake glanced at her. Any regrets? She looked back at the town, at Thomas Whitfield's grand house on the hill, at the life she'd almost settled for. Then she looked ahead, at the open country stretching before them, at the mountains blue in the distance. "None," she said, and meant it. The road to Copper Ridge wound through valleys and over ridges, through stands of pine and across clear streams. They talked as they rode, really talked, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Jake told her about growing up on a failing farm in Missouri, about the war, about coming west to find something better. Caroline told him about her father, about Philadelphia, about the suffocating weight of being respectable and proper when what she really wanted was to be real. By the time Copper Ridge appeared in the distance, a handful of buildings clustered in a valley, Caroline felt like she'd known Jake for years instead of weeks, felt like she could trust him with the broken, hopeful truth of herself. The schoolhouse was small, the house beside it even smaller, but they were clean and sturdy, and the old schoolmaster who greeted them had kind eyes and a firm handshake. "You'll do well here," he told Caroline. "The children need someone who understands that learning is about more than facts. It's about possibility." That word again, possibility. Caroline started teaching the following Monday. 23 children, aged 6 to 16, crowded into the schoolhouse. They were tough and skeptical at first, these frontier children, but Caroline had learned something about herself in recent weeks. She was tougher than she'd known. She met their skepticism with honesty, their challenges with patience, their hunger for knowledge with everything she had. And Jake was there, not hovering, not interfering, just present. He fixed a loose shutter on her house. He brought her firewood as the weather turned cold. He ate dinner at her table sometimes, and they talked about books and ranching and what makes a life meaningful. 3 months after she arrived in Copper Ridge, Jake kissed her for the first time. It was after a school program where her students performed a play they'd written themselves. He'd watched from the back, smiling at her pride in them. Walking her home afterward, under stars so bright they hurt, he stopped and turned to her. Caroline Merrick, he said quietly, I'm in love with you. Her heart stumbled. Jake, I know it's soon, I know you've been through hell, but I can't keep it inside anymore. I love you. I love your courage and your kindness and the way you look at those kids like they're made of gold. I love how you laugh when you think no one's listening. I love, his voice caught, I love everything about you. Caroline reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his jaw, the warmth of his skin. I love you too, she whispered. And it's not too soon, it's exactly right. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home, not to a place, but to herself, to the woman she'd always been underneath the fear and propriety, the woman who was brave enough to choose love over safety, possibility over certainty. They married in the spring, with the schoolchildren throwing wildflowers and the whole town of Copper Ridge celebrating. It was nothing like the wedding Thomas had planned, no fancy dress, no crowd of important people. Just honesty and joy and two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of broken plans. Years later, Caroline would think back to that moment on the train platform when she'd first seen Jake Brennan and thought everything was wrong. She'd been right, in a way. He was the wrong man for the life she'd planned. But he was exactly right for the life she needed. And standing on the porch of their small house, watching their daughter play in the yard while Jake rode in from the day's work, Caroline understood that destiny wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you chose, again and again, every day. She'd chosen courage over comfort, truth over security, love over fear. She'd been the wrong bride for Thomas Whitfield's ambitions. But she was the exactly right woman for the life she'd built. Jake dismounted and walked toward her, and his smile still made her breath catch. Hey there, Mrs. Brennan. Hey there yourself, Mr. Brennan. He pulled her close, and she leaned into him, feeling the solid reality of this life they'd created. Not perfect, never easy, but true, and that made all the difference.